Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to Babel on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Mem of Masechta Ayruvin, Daf 40. Lots of good stuff on this Daf, Chavir, lots of good stuff. We start off talking about items brought from outside of the Tchum. That's kind of a continuation of a sugya that we got to the very end of, at the very end of yesterday's Daf. Melacha done for a Yid on Yom Tov Sheni. Okay. Mentioning Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashana, right? Do you, in Musaf of Rosh Hashana, do you have to say anything about the fact that it's Rosh Chodesh as well? Then we talk about mentioning Rosh Chodesh on Shabbos. Okay, how do you do that? Yalav Yavo, not Yalav Yavo. Okay, we'll see. And do you say the bracha of Shehecheyanu on Rosh Hashana and Yom Kipur? These are the topics covered in today's daf. Chavre, Daf Mem, about 5-6 lines into the page. Ha'ulifta da'asil mechoza. So it was Yom Tiv, and there was a certain turnip, and the turnip showed up in mechoza, and they wanted to know, can we purchase and eat this turnip? Now it was Yom Tiv, but apparently there are ways that you can purchase things on Yom Tiv. I don't know, credit, things like that. I'm not really familiar with them. But anyways, the fact of the matter is, there was a turnip, showed up in mechoza on Yom Tiv, and the people wanted to know, can we eat this turnip? So Nafak Rava Chazia Dechmisha. So Rava went out, he inspected the turnip, he said, alright, this turnip is a little bit withered. So Shara Rava Lemizbon Mine Amar Havada Mi Ismo Nekra. Rava said, okay, the people can buy this turnip. It's a little bit withered, which means that it's not fresh from today. It was from yesterday, which was during the week. It was chol. And therefore, the people can enjoy this turnip today on Yom Tov. Mayamart Michutz Tchum Asya. Rava continues and he says, because after all, what's about the worst you could say about this turnip? That it came from outside of the Tchum on Yom Tov? Habab b'shvil Yisrael zeh mutar lechol Yisrael acher. Well, we know that if someone comes from outside of the Tchum on Yom Tov, so the person who was brought for may not be able to consume it, but other people can. V'chol shekin hai, and certainly in this case, that also, that these people who brought in this turnip on Yom Tov didn't bring it in with the assumption that the Jews would be buying it. They assumed that the Gentiles would be buying it. After all, the majority of the people in the town were Gentile. So, therefore, the turnip was not picked today. And it was brought in from outside the Tchum. The fact of the matter is, it wasn't brought in for the Yidden from outside the Tchum, it was brought in for the Nachrim, for the Gentiles from outside of the Tchum. So therefore, there's really no reason to say that the Yidden should be unable to eat this turnip on Yom Tov. But then Rava noticed that actually these merchants were bringing in lots of extra turnips because they realized that they have a new market with the Jews. So and then it's no longer a case where the turnips are being brought for the non-Jews, the turnips are being brought for the Jews from outside of the Tchum on Yom Tov. So at that point, Rava had to say that that the Jews can no longer buy these turnips on Yom Tov because they are being brought from outside of the Tchum for them. Okay. Hanu b'nei ganana d'gazlu asa b'yom tov sheni. So there were these b'nei ganana. The b'nei ganana, they would build bridal canopies. They would build chuppahs, and in the chuppahs they would put hadasim. I think that's myrtle. Hadasim, like the stuff that we use in our lulavs, and it smells good. So these non-Jewish people on Yom Tov Sheni, on the second day of Yom Tov, they would clip for these chuppah builders hadasim, so that they can include it in their chuppah. Okay. Now, l'or tasharu Ravina l'oruche be'le altar, and on Motzai Yom Tov, Ravina said that these chuppah builders can smell the hadasim immediately. They don't have to wait at all. They can consume the hadasim immediately. Okay, fine. So what's this a case of? This is a case of Gentiles, of non-Jewish people, who did melacha for Jews. And in this case, it was on Yom Tov Sheni. And Ravina said, you can smell it immediately after Yom Tov. Alright, fine. Amalei Rava bar Tachlifa le Ravina. Now Rava bar Tachlifa says to Ravina, Leisa lu ma'im mipnei she'enim b'nei Torah. Alright. So Rava bar Tachlifa, he says to Ravina, hey Ravina, you should really say that these chuppah builders are unable to smell these hadasim immediately after Yom Tov, because these chuppah builders are not B'nai Torah, and if you allow them to smell these hadasim immediately after Yom Tov, they're gonna not take Yom Tov seriously. Maskefler of Shmaya. Now Rav Shmaya overhears this conversation and he says, "What in the world? Time of the Ein B'nai Torah? What is their religiosity? What is their commitment to halacha have to do with anything over here? Ha B'nai Torah Shari? What if they were B'nai Torah? Then they would be permitted to smell these hadasim immediately after Yom Tov. We know that if a non-Jew does a malacha for a Jew on Shabbos, you have to wait after Shabbos enough time that you could have done it yourself. I.e., you can't, so to make sure that you're not specifically getting benefit from the malacha that was dafka done on Shabbos, you have to wait enough time that you could have done it already after Shabbos. So, over here also, what does that have to do with if they're B'nai Torah or not? The fact of the matter is, if these non-Jewish people clipped these hadasim for these chuppah builders on Yom Tov, they should have to wait until after Yom Tov, enough time that it takes to clip some hadasim. Can't imagine that that's too long. So Azlu Shailu the Rava, so they went and they asked the Rava, Amalu, and Rava responded to them, that Rav Shmaya is 100% correct, that you would have to wait enough time after Yom Tov that you could have clipped these hadasim yourself, and then you can smell them. Okay, fine. Rav Dosa Omera over Lifnei Teva Chule. So Rav Dosa said in our Mishnah that somebody who's the Shliach Tzibur on Rosh Hashana, so in addition to mentioning that it's Rosh Hashana, you also mention that it is Rosh Chodesh. Now, Rav Dosa said two things. He said, yes, that you mentioned that it's Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashana. However, he also said that you make some kind of interesting Tanai and say, well, we don't really know which day is really Rosh Hashana. So if today is Rosh Chodesh, so then we mean today. If tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh, then we mean tomorrow. Then the next day he says, if it's today, then today. If not, then yesterday. Ki'ilu. He goes on this whole arichus, right? So according to Rav Dosa, you mentioned two things: A, that it's Rosh Chodesh, and B, this Tanai about the fact that you're not sure which day is actually Rosh Chodesh. Now, the Mishnah had said that the Chacham disagree with Rav Dosa, and the question is, on what do they disagree? Do they disagree and argue that you don't mention Rosh Chodesh bichlal on Rosh Hashanah? Or maybe they say, no, you mention Rosh Chodesh, just don't do this whole stipulation thing. So this is what we need to figure out. So I'm a Rabbah, Kiavin and Rav Huna. Oh, so Rabbah says that when he was by the Bismedrash of Rav Huna, what I like about this, what's interesting to me about that is it kind of shows you that Rabbah was spending some time with Rav Huna, probably as his Rebbe, right? Rabbah, of course, was one of the Rosh Yeshiva of Pumbedisa. Rav Yehuda was the first Rosh Yeshiva of Pumbedisa. So Mistama, Rabbah was a student of Rav Yehuda, but you also see that over here that he also spent some time with Rav Huna, who was the same generation of Rav Yehuda. Rav Huna was in Surah, which is where Rav was. So Rav Huna was a student of Rav. And then I guess Rav Yehuda started the yeshiva Rav Yehuda was also a student of Rav and Shmuel, but I guess he started the yeshiva in Pumbedisa. Fine. Anyways, so Amar Rabbah, Ki Avinan Be Rav Huna. So Rabbah says that when we would learn by the Medrash of Rav Huna, so Iba Yalan, we asked, Ma'od Azka Rosh Chodesh Rosh Hashanah. So do you mention Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah? So on the one hand, do we say Kevin the Chalukim b'Musafin Amrinan? Do we say, look, since they have separate korban musafs, you have the musaf offering of Rosh Hashanah, you have the musaf offering of Rosh Chodesh, they have their own offerings, and you do them both on Rosh Hashanah. So maybe we should mention Rosh Chodesh separately. So on Rosh Hashanah, in addition to mentioning Rosh Hashanah in the davening, you also mention Rosh Chodesh in the davening. Odilma zikaron echad od l'chan. Or maybe you just mention one zikaron, and that works for both of them. Or you mention Rosh Hashanah, and that works for Rosh Chodesh as well. That is what Rabbah wanted to know. Amarlan. And Rav Huna responded to us, Tanisua. Well, after all, we can look in our Mishnah. Rabbi Dosa Omer, says Rabbi Dosa, Ha'over l'fnei ha'teva v'chulei. So Rabbi Dosa had said, somebody who is the Shliach Tzibur on Rosh Hashanah, he mentions Rosh Chodesh as well, and the Chacham disagree. So what do we see? So my lab, Lazkir, Mistama, the Chacham disagree with Rabbi Dosa, and they say that you do not mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah. That was Rav Huna's argument, that we see from the Machlokas between Rabbi Dosa and the Chachamim, that we would not mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah. Fine. Lo the Hasnos. The Gemara says, no. That's not what the Chachamim are arguing on Reb Dosa about. The Chacham agree with Reb Dosa that you should mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashana. What they argue about is this whole stipulation, this Tanai thing that Reb Dosa does. If today is really Rosh Chodesh, then today, if not, then tomorrow, and then the next he says if today, if not yesterday, right? He makes this whole stipulation. The Chacham say, leave me alone with the stipulations, but they do agree that you would mention Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashana. Okay, fine, or at least you can argue that way. And this also makes sense to argue that the Chachamim agree with Reb Dosa regarding mentioning Rosh Chodesh. They just disagree with the whole Tanai thing. Because we actually have a Braisa. And what does it say in this Braisa? That this machlokas between Reb Dosa and the Chachamim wasn't limited to Rosh Hashanah. They would have this machlokas every single month of the year. That Reb Dosa would do this, and the Chachamim would argue, right? And if what we're saying is that they were arguing about mentioning Rosh Chodesh Bichlal, that Reb Dosa would mention Rosh Chodesh, and the Chacham would argue, so you can argue that makes sense in the context of Rosh Hashanah, that the Chacham said that you don't mention Rosh Chodesh, but apparently this machlokas was every month of the year. Now, it wouldn't really make much sense to say that Reb Dosa every month of the year mentioned Rosh Chodesh, and the Chacham said, what are you doing mentioning Rosh Chodesh? What do you mean it's Rosh Chodesh? Why shouldn't I mention Rosh Chodesh? Right? So therefore, it makes more sense to say that, no, the Chachamim agree with Reb Dosa that you mention Rosh Chodesh all the months of the year, as well as on Rosh Hashanah as well. What they disagree with is this stipulation, that every month of the year, in addition to mentioning Rosh Chodesh, Reb Dosa would also say, if today is Rosh Chodesh, then whatever, you make the whole thing. The Chacham didn't agree with that during all the months of the year, and they also didn't agree with that in terms of Rosh Hashanah. Fine. So now the Gemara explains, so I understand if you say what the rabbis argue about with Reb Dosa is whether or not you make this stipulation. That is why the Chachamim did not agree with Reb Dosa every month of the year. But if you're saying that the Chachamim are arguing with Reb Dosa about mentioning Rosh Chodesh Bichlal, why would they have any issue with mentioning Rosh Chodesh just on regular Rosh Chodeshes? Okay, so it must be that the Chachamim agree with Reb Dosa that you mention Rosh Chodesh. What they disagree with is making the stipulation about whether today is Rosh Chodesh or tomorrow, then the next day saying if today was Chodesh or maybe yesterday was Rosh Chodesh, that they do away with. But then the Gemara says, 1 second, so we're saying that what the Chachamim disagree with is that they say that you don't make this Tanai. But lama li ifluge betarte. How come we need this machlokas twice? How come the Chacham have to argue both when it comes to every month of the year as well as when it comes to Rosh Hashanah that you don't make the Tanai? Why do I need to teach the same machlokas twice? So tzricha. So the Gemara says that that we do need to mention that this machlokas was by every month of the year as well as on Rosh Hashanah. How come? The Ashmina Rosh Hashanah. Because if we would only have this machlokas between Reb Dosa and the Chachamim about do you have to make a Tanai or not, in the context of Rosh Hashanah, Hava Amina, I would think, B'haka Amir Rabbanan, only by Rosh Hashanah is where the rabbis say, do not make this Tanai. Tilo, Rabbanan Tilo, Mishum Da'asi L'Zalzulebe. Because they're concerned that if you make a Tanai in Rosh Hashanah and you highlight the fact that we're not really sure if today is actually Rosh Hashanah or not, maybe it's actually just a weekday, well then people will come and take lightly Rosh Hashanah. Now Rosh Hashanah is something that is an Isser Malacha. You're not allowed to do Malacha on Rosh Hashanah. And if we're going to be highlighting the fact that we're not actually sure if today is really Rosh Hashanah, well then people might end up doing Malacha because they won't take it seriously. But just in a regular old Rosh Chodesh, of a random month of the year where there isn't really such, significant things at stake, if people don't take it seriously, the fact of the matter is that every Rosh Chodesh, we're not sure if it's actually Rosh Chodesh or not. Now, of course, we have the fixed calendar, so we know. But when it was based on if people would see the moon or not, so you don't actually know if today is Rosh Chodesh, maybe tomorrow is going to be Rosh Chodesh. You'll find out when the messengers come and let you know what Bezdin said, but that's only going to be much later. So therefore, you can make maybe the Chacham would say that you can make the Tanai for the rest of the days of the year, for the rest of the months of the year, because the fact of the matter is we don't know which day is Rosh Chodesh. So therefore, we need the Chachamim, we need both prices to show that the Chachamim even argue just on regular old Rosh Chodeshes, and they would argue that you do not make a Tanai even then. Now, v'i itmar b'ha. Now, if you would only then have, if we would only give the example of Rosh Chodeshes of every day of every month of the year, and the Chachamim say that you do not make a Tanai, then certainly you wouldn't make a Tanai on Rosh Hashana. Well, then b'ha ka'amar Reb Dosa, I might then argue that only there is that Rosh Hashana, that Rosh Chodesh of every month of the year is where Reb Dosa says that you make the Tanai, right? Because there isn't much at stake over here. But I might think that when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, he will agree with the Chachamim that you don't make the Tanai because we're concerned about people not taking Rosh Hashanah seriously. Therefore, you need the case of Rosh Hashanah as well to show that Reb Dosa also argues with the Chachamim even by Rosh Hashanah and says even in Rosh Hashanah you still make the stipulation, and he's not concerned with people not taking Rosh Hashanah seriously enough. Okay, fine. No, so what did we just say? We basically we just made the argument that to mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah, that the Chachamim only argue with Reb Dosa in the Mishnah regarding making this Tanai, but they would agree with Reb Dosa that you would mention Rosh Chodesh even on Rosh Hashanah. Meisvei, we have a kasha on this notion, this argument. We have a kasha on the argument to say that on Rosh Hashanah you mention Rosh Chodesh. What's the argument? Rosh Hashanah shcholios b'Shabbos. So if you have Rosh Hashanah that falls out on Shabbos, okay? B'Shami omim mispal eser, v'sil omim mispal teisha. So generally in Musaf we have 9 brachas in the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah. What are those 9 brachas? So you have the 3 at the beginning, you have the 3 at the end, then you have Malchus, Zichronos, and Shofaros in the middle. So that's 9 brachas. Now, the Bryce is saying, what happens if Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos? Does the fact that it's Shabbos, do we add a bracha for Shabbos? So, B'Shamai Omim Mispal Eser, B'Shamai says that, yes, we add a separate bracha for Shabbos. B'Sil Omim Mispal Teisha. B'Sil says, no, you don't add a bracha, you'll somehow include Shabbos, in some other bracha, but it's not going to get its own bracha. Now, here's the question. Now, so apparently we see that according to Beis Shammai, each kind of thing gets its own bracha. Each mentioning gets its own bracha. Right? That if it's Shabbos, Shabbos gets its own bracha. And we want to argue that if we would be mentioning Rosh Chodesh in Rosh Hashanah davening, well then Rosh Chodesh should also, according to Beis Shammai, get its own bracha, and there would be 11 brachas in the Shmona Esrei on Musaf Rosh Hashanah. Right? From the fact that Beis Shammai says that you add a bracha for Shabbos, but we're not adding a bracha for Rosh Chodesh, it must be because we're not mentioning Bechlal Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah. Because Beis Shammai's opinion is that you add a bracha for each individual mentioning, and therefore Shabbos gets its own bracha. And from the fact that they don't say anything about Rosh Chodesh, it must be because Rosh Chodesh isn't mentioned Bechlal. Fine. Now you can't bring any proof really from Beis Hillel because Beis Hillel doesn't add any brachas anyway. So it could be that according to Beis Hillel, you mention Rosh Chodesh, it just doesn't get its own bracha. But according to Beis Shammai, who's adding brachas for each additional mentioning, that's why they're saying that when it's Shabbos, there's now 10 brachas. Well, if we would be mentioning Rosh Chodesh, it would have its own bracha. From the fact that it doesn't get its own bracha, it's because mentioning Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah is bichlal not a thing. Amar Reb Zera argues that actually he answers the question and says that you can still argue that we mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah. Well, if that's the case, then why isn't Beis Shammai giving it its own bracha? So the answer is, Shiny Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh is different than Shabbos. Right? Shabbos gets its own bracha, but even Beis Shammai would say that Rosh Chodesh does not get its own bracha, because mitoch shekolel l'shachris v'arvis kol anami b'musafin. Because since we are including Rosh Chodesh, at Shachris, and at Mariv, we include it also at Musaf. What does that mean? It means that we include it in the bracha that talks about the day. Meaning, Rosh Chodesh. So basically, at Shachris and at Mariv, you would say Mekadesh Yisrael V'Yom HaZikaron V'Rosh Chodashim. Right? You include Rosh Chodesh in the bracha of Rosh Hashana, and therefore, Reb Zeir says you can argue that you do mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashana, but it doesn't get its own bracha, even according to Beis Shammai, because just like at Shachris and at Mariv, it's included in the bracha for Rosh Hashanah. So also at Musaf, it's included in the bracha for Rosh Hashanah. We don't give it its own bracha, but Shabbos would get its own bracha because it's not included in the other brachas. Okay, fine. Seder. Okay, so Reb Zeir kind of stands up for the argument that you would mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah. Umi islu leVeis Shammai kola. But one second, does Beis Shammai really say this, that you would include Rosh Chodesh with the Rosh Hashanah bracha? Ve'atani, but we learn in the Brisa, Rosh Chodesh Chalios b'Shabbos. If you have Rosh Chodesh that falls out on Shabbos, Beis Shammai om mispal shmone, we still om mispal sheva. Beis Shammai says that you would make 8 brachas in Musaf. That Beis Shammai is saying that you would say that when you have Rosh Chodesh that falls out on Shabbos, you make 8 brachas in Musaf. So what do we see? That Rosh Chodesh does get its own bracha. That Beis Shammai's opinion is that when Rosh Chodesh needs to be mentioned, it gets its own bracha. As we see that when Rosh Chodesh falls out on Shabbos, you say 8 brachas in Musaf. Beis Hillel says no, you only say 7 Seder, because they have their same opinion like we saw by Rosh Hashanah that falls out on Shabbos, that it would still only be 9 brachas. Beis Shammai had said that when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, it becomes 10 brachas because you had one for Shabbos. Now, what was the question that we asked? We said if mentioning Rosh Chodesh in Musaf on Rosh Hashanah was a thing, well then Beis Shammai would say that it would be 11 brachas. But Beis Shammai didn't say that it's 11 brachas. It must be that Rosh Chodesh is not actually a thing, that you don't actually mention Rosh Chodesh on Musaf. Reb Zeir tried to answer by saying, no, you could say that really you do mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah in Musaf, just that it's included in the other brachas. But then we say, no way, no how. We know that Beis Shammai's opinion is that if you're going to be mentioning Rosh Chodesh, it would get its own bracha. As we see by when Rosh Chodesh falls out on Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh gets its own bracha. And therefore, if mentioning Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah was a thing, then Beis Shammai would have said that it got its own bracha. Beis Shammai doesn't say that Rosh Chodesh gets its own bracha. Therefore, it's clearly not a thing. And the Gemara says, Kasha. Yeah, it's a good question. It's going to be difficult for us to maintain our argument that we mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah, because then it's strange that Beis Shammai doesn't give it its own bracha. So it sounds like we do not mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah. Okay, fine. Now, when it comes to mentioning Rosh Chodesh in Shmona Esrei, so the question is, how exactly do you mention it? So Beis Shammai, we saw that you make it its own bracha. Okay, we're going to see another machlokas tanaim about how exactly you can mention Rosh Chodesh in Shmona Esrei. Do you do it in Yalav Yavo? Do you do it maybe as part of the Birkas Hayom? Let's see. So v'chol atzmo tanaihi. Actually, the way that you go about mentioning Rosh Chodesh in Shmona Esrei is a machlokas tanaim. The Tanya, as we learn in the Brisa, Shabbos chalios b'Rosh Chodesh. So if you have Shabbos, that's Rosh Chodesh, or maybe it's Chol HaMoed. So what does Shmona Esrei on Shabbos look like? So Arvis, Shachris, Umincha. So when it comes to Mariv, Shachris, and Mincha, Mispal Kedarko, Sheva. So you just do the regular Shabbos Shmona Esrei. V'omer me'ena ma'ora ba'avoda. And you say Yalav V'yavo for Rosh Chodesh or for Yom Tov in Modim. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Be'odah. Rabbi Eliezer says that you say Yalav Yavo, or Me'ena Ma'ora at least, maybe like Al Anisim or something, although what would be the nes? I guess you would say like Yalav Yavo, I guess, but just in Al Kulam. Okay, in the next bracha. Fine. Vimlo Amar, and if you skipped Yalav Yavo, Machzirin also, you gotta start over. Uv Musafin. And when it comes to Musaf, Maschil B'Shal Shabbos, U'Mesayim B'Shal Shabbos, U'Omer Kedushas Hayom Be'emtza. And in Musaf, you don't say Yalav Yavo. Instead, you in the bracha of Musaf of Shabbos, you include in there the korbanos of Rosh Chodesh or Yom Tif, whatever it might be. So basically, according to the Tanna Kama, you don't include, in terms of Kola, you don't include Rosh Chodesh with Shabbos by Shacharis and Mincha and Mariv. There you would say Yalav Yavo in either Modim or Hodah, whether it's Rabbi Eliezer or the Tanna Kama. But at Musaf, you don't say Yalav Yavo. Instead, you include it, you include it in the bracha of Shabbos. And inside of that bracha, you mention either Rosh Chodesh or Yom Tov. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbi Shmuel ben Rosh, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Omrim, Kol makom shezakuk l'sheva, any place where you can have 7 brachas, i.e., even Shacharis, Mincha, and Mariv on Shabbos, Maschil b'shel Shabbos, u'Mesayim b'shel Shabbos, v'omer kedushas hayom be'emtza. So Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Shmuel ben Rosh, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, they argue and say that you don't say Yalav Yavo b'chlal. You don't say Yalav Yavo. Rather, in the bracha of Shabbos, you will include, even at Shachos Mincha Mariv, you will include something about Rosh Chodesh. Fine. Seder. My Havela. So how do we paskin in terms of Rosh Hashana? Right? Do we mention Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashana or not? So Amr of Chizda said of Chizda Zikaron Echad Olelo Lechan Ulechan. You just mention Rosh Hashana, and that counts for Rosh Chodesh as well. V'chein Amr Rabba Zikaron Echad Olelo Lechan Ulechan. Although the Zikir side changes it to Rava, and the argument is that makes more sense because it's Rabba who actually asked the question, so maybe Rava is answering the question. But yeah, Zikaron Echad Olelo Lechan Ulechan, that you mention Rosh Hashana, and that counts for Rosh Chodesh as well. Okay. Now, we move on to the question of, do you say Shehecheyanu v'kiyimanu v'giyanu l'zman hazeh on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? Rama Rabba, said Rabba once again, Ki avina bei Rav Huna, when I was by the Bismedrish of Rav Huna in Surah Mistama. Iba Yalan, we asked, Ma'u lomer zman Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippur? Do you say Shehecheyanu v'kiyimanu v'giyanu on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? Kevan de mizman lizman asi amrinan. So on the one hand we could say, well, it comes from time to time, I guess every year. So you could say Shehecheyanu. Odilma kevan de lo ikru regalim lo amrinan. Or maybe since it's not one of the shalosh regalim, we don't say Shehecheyanu and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur lo have a biyadeh, and Rav Huna did not know the answer. Okay. Ki asai be Rav Yehuda, and now says Rabba that when I got to Rav Yehuda, Mistama and Pumpedisa, so Amar, Ana, I said, so Rav Yehuda responded to this question of, do you say Shehecheyanu on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? Ana akra chadata nami amin azman. Rav Yehuda says, look, I even make Shehecheyanu on a new gourd that I find in my garden. So, if I make a Shehecheyanu on a new gourd, I can make a Shehecheyanu on a new year or on Yom Kippur. So Amrle Rishus Loka Mibayali. So Rabbi says, look, I'm not asking about can I make a Shehecheyanu on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Ki makamibayali chova. I want to know, must I make a Shehecheyanu on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? So what's the halacha? So Amrle Rav Shmuel Damar Tarvayu Ein Omer Zman Ela B'Shalosh Regalim. So Rav Yehuda responded and said that Rav and Shmuel both say that Shehecheyanu is reserved for the Shalosh Regalim. You do not say it on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Meisvei, we have a kasha against Rav and Shmuel. Tein chelik l'shiva v'gam l'shmona. Okay? The pasuk in Koheles says, give a portion to 7 and even to 8. Okay? The pasuk is saying that you should be very gracious because you never know when you're going to need it back. Seder. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Shiva elu zayin yimei breishis. Rabbi Eliezer says that when the pasuk is talking about 7, it's talking about the 7 days of creation. Shmona elu chesimei mila, that 8 are the 8 days before bris mila. Rabbi Yoshua Omer, Shiva elu shiva yimei Pesach. Rabbi Yoshua says that 7 refers to the 7 days of Pesach. Shmona elu shmona yimei Chag, that 8 refers to the 8 days of Sukkot. Uchshu Omer v'gam, and when it says v'gam, right, the pasuk said ten chelek l'shiva v'gam l'shmona. What's v'gam and also coming to include? L'rabos atzeres v'Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippurim, to include Shavuos as well as Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And the question is, what are we talking about in terms of Pesach and Sukkot and Shavuos and Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, like including what? So my lav lizman. What it means is that we're saying that on all of these holidays, including Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we say Shehecheyanu, lo levracha. No, what it's saying is that on all of these things you make a bracha. It gets its own bracha. Okay, beseder. Fine. So Rav and Shmuel had said that you do not say Shehecheyanu on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We tried to prove from this brayso that Rabbi Yeshua's opinion is that on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur you would say Shehecheyanu. We say no, it's just talking about that you make a bracha on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Fine. Hachinami mistavra, and it also makes sense that it's talking about bracha disakadaitich lizman, because if you want to say that this pasuk is talking about Shehecheyanu, well, zman kol shiva mi'ika. What are you saying Shehecheyanu all of the 7 days of Pesach? No, you say it once for all of Pesach. But then the Gemara says halo kasha. No, that's not a good proof. You could still say that it's talking about Shehecheyanu. Di lo mevarich ha'idna mevarich l'macher u'liyom ochra. What it's saying is that all 7 days of Pesach you say Shehecheyanu, meaning not all 7 days. If you didn't make it on day 1, so you make it on day 2. If you didn't make it on day 2 yet, so you can make it on day 3, But it's not saying that you would say it all of the days. But still, mikol makom binun kos. But still, you would have to make the bracha of Shehecheyanu on a cup of wine. The glass of wine is only going to be on the first night of Pesach. Can we say maybe that this supports Rav Nachman, who says that Shehecheyanu you can even say in the middle of the market, i.e. you don't need a glass of wine. So maybe we could say that, okay, so this pasuk is talking about Shehecheyanu, and it's all 7 days, and you don't even need a glass of wine. So halo kasha dikla leikos. No, don't ask that, because you could say where he has a glass of wine. I don't know, it's Pesach, he's drinking wine every day, and he could say Shehecheyanu if he didn't say it yet. Okay, fine. So Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur mechiyavin. Well, to say that he says Shehecheyanu on a glass of wine on Rosh Hashanah and on Shavuos, that makes sense. But what about Yom Kippur? How are you going to make Shehecheyanu on a glass of wine for Yom Kippur? So if he's going to make Shehecheyanu and then drink the glass of wine, once he says Shehecheyanu, he's already accepting upon himself Yom Kippur, and he can no longer drink. Because after all, if we remember the Gemara in Brachos, where Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba asks Rav, he said, right, it was a cloudy day, and Rav already accepted Shabbos upon himself, and Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba said, did you already accept upon yourself that you're not going to do malacha? In badilna, yes, I already accepted upon myself not to do malacha. So we see that once you accept upon yourself not to do malacha, so you don't do malacha anymore. So you're also, once he already says Shehecheyanu for Yom Kippur, you shouldn't be able to drink this wine anymore. That was the Gemara that proved that Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba was a Talmud Chaver of Rav from the fact that he didn't say mibadil mar, he just said mibadil. So livroch ale v'lanche. So another option could be, well, just make Shehecheyanu and then leave the cup and don't drink it. But hamavarich tzarich shiyitom. But if you make a bracha, you have to taste it. You can't just make a bracha and leave it. So leis v'liyanuka. Okay, so then maybe make the Shehecheyanu and then let a little kid drink it. But we say no, you can't do that, because we don't want this little kid to get in the habit of like drinking wine on Yom Kippur, because when he gets older he'll still drink wine on Yom Kippur. We don't want that. No. So Ma'avela, what do we do about this whole thing with Shehecheyanu on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah and Shavuos and everything? So, well, Shavuos mistama you'd say Shehecheyanu because it's Shalosh Regalim. What about Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? So Shadru Rabbanan Rav Yemar Sava Kamid Rav Chizda. So the rabbi sent Rav Yemar Sava to Rav Chizda b'maile Yoma de Reishata before Rosh Hashanah, and they said Amule, and they said to Rav Yemar Sava Zil Chazi Hechi Avid Uvda, go and spy for us. We want you to go on Rosh Hashanah and see what Rav Chizda does. Does Rav Chizda say Shehecheyanu on a glass of wine? And then Ta Emalan, and whatever he does, come and tell us, and that way we'll know, do you say Shehecheyanu on Rosh Hashanah and Mistam Yom Kippur as well? So Kichazye, when Rav Chizda saw Rav Yemar Sava, he said, Tluya Lirativa Rav Saleh Beduchte, that if somebody lifts up a moist branch of wood on Yom Tif, so clearly he's not going to be throwing it into fire because it's wet, and it's not going to burn well. Clearly he must need its place. He must need something from where that wood is. So here also, Rav Chizda saw Rav Yemar Sava, he said, uh-oh, these guys must need something from me. What do they want? So Aisu lekas dechamra Chodesh v'amazman. And they brought Rav Chizda a glass of wine, and when he made Kiddush, he said Shehecheyanu on Rosh Hashana. So v'ilchasa omer zman Rosh Hashana v'yom Kippurim. So the halacha is that you do say Shehecheyanu on Rosh Hashana and Yom Kippur. V'ilchasa zman omer afilu b'shuk. And the halacha is also that you can say Shehecheyanu even in the middle of the market without a glass of wine. And mistama, that's going to be how you're going to say Shehecheyanu on Yom Kippur without a glass of wine. Cheved, that was daf mem of Masechta Ayruvin. Let us review the several items that we had discussed. So first we talked about items brought from outside of the tchum, right? We saw that they brought that turnip, and Rava said it's really no problem because it's long, as long as it wasn't brought for you. If it was brought for somebody else, it was acceptable. In the case of mechoza, these turnips were brought for the Gentiles, therefore the Jews can take advantage of them, of these turnips can use these turnips on Yom Tov. Melacha done for Yid and Yom Tov Sheni. That was interesting. So we had these people who make canopies, wedding canopies. And Ravina said that they could smell the hadassim that were brought to them from the non-Jews on Yom Tov Sheni. You could smell them immediately after Yom Tov. Rava said you have to wait enough time that it takes to be able to clip these hadassim yourself. I wonder why Ravina said that you could smell them immediately, right? Because after all, it was non-Jewish people doing malacha for you to bring you these hadassim, to harvest and bring you these hadassim on Yom Tov. Maybe it has to do with the fact that it was Yom Tov Sheni, Ravina was being mekel. I don't know. Mentioning Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashana. So there are two ways you could look at it. One argument is to say, yes, you mentioned Rosh Chodesh. And when the Chachamim argued with Reb Dosa in the Mishnah, they were only arguing with the fact that he would make this whole fancy Tanai thing about if today's Rosh Chodesh or not. But they agree that you would mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashana. The other way to say is that no, you don't mention Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashana, because if you would, then Beis Shammai would have mentioned it as its own bracha. And the fact that they don't say that on Rosh Hashana, you make a separate bracha for Rosh Chodesh, clearly then mentioning Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashana is not a thing. Okay? Then we talked about how do you mention Rosh Chodesh on Shabbos. So when it comes to Musaf, you include it in the bracha about Shabbos. You also include Rosh Chodesh. When it comes to Shachris, Mincha, and Mariv, so according to the Tanakama, you would say Yalev Yavo in the bracha of Modim. According to Rabbi Eliezer, you would say Yalev Yavo in the bracha of Hodah, in Al Kulam. And according to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Shmuel ben Rosh, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, you would include also in Shachris, Mincha, and Mariv, you would include Rosh Chodesh in the bracha for Shabbos. Okay? Then we got into, do you say Shehecheyanu on Rosh Hashana and on Yom Kippur? So Rav and Shmuel say that you only say Shehecheyanu, you only have a chiyuv to say Shehecheyanu on the Shalosh Regalim, not including Rosh Hashana and Yom Kippur. Whereas, meaning that excludes Rosh Hashana and Yom Kippur. Whereas Rabbi Yoshua, we had this brayso in which Rabbi Yoshua was talking about Pesach and Shavuos and Sukkot and also Rosh Hashana and Yom Kippur, and we said that that's talking about saying Shehecheyanu. And we concluded that the halacha is that we do say Shehecheyanu on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and you can even say it not with a glass of wine. Cheved, that was daf mem of Masechta Ayruvin. Hope you enjoyed. Peace out.